Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's event. My name is Christine Callender, and along with Dr. Sama Salaji and Diane Warner, we co-convene the BERA Race, Ethnicity and Education SIG, which is hosting today's event. The report being presented today is one of 5 funded by BERA and is designed to examine race and ethnicity across the education sector. The small grants are integral to BERA's race equality policy and its commitment to address racial inequities within the wider research community. Today's event will provide an update on the report, Strengthening Teacher Networks, Decolonising Secondary School History Curricula, written by Dr. Anna Rolson-Ross from Manchester Metropolitan University. She'll be joined by Liz Thorpe, who is a learning officer at the People's History Museum, and Janine Ahl, who is the head of history at Abraham Moss Community School in Manchester. The aim of this project was to incorporate decolonial practices as a key aspect of teacher development and involves practitioners as well as academic researchers. After the presentation from Anna, the paper will be critiqued by Dr. Diane Warner, also from Manchester Metropolitan University, as respondent. Delegates will also have an opportunity to ask questions throughout, either via the chat function or after Diane has given her response. So I'm now going to hand you over to Anna and her colleagues to do the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Christine. Yes, so and thanks, Janine and Liz, for joining me. So said we're going to try and stick to 10 minutes each. So I'll start just kind of setting out a little bit about the project, just to give you a little bit of kind of background and, you know, how we sort of facilitated that, I guess. So in terms of the, in terms of the network, I'm the PGC lead for the history course at MMU, Manchester Met University. So we sort of, as a starting point, I wanted to talk to mentors and strengthening teacher networks more generally. So actually the project grew out of this idea that I had, rather than it being a research project. And then I kind of sort of developed that afterwards. Because I wanted to use the partnerships that we had already to sort of share experiences and share practices and that sort of thing linked to the decolonizing of the history curriculum. So we had network meetings that we set up from November 2021 until March 2022. And the idea and my kind of key thing was that I wanted it to be a collaborative process, and I wanted it to be a co-produced kind of project, because like I say, it kind of grew out of my interest, but also wanting to kind of develop these networks with teachers to support each other and to hopefully kind of support teacher agency, I guess. I mean, the Runnymede reports and that sort of thing on secondary schools talk quite a lot about that, kind of the importance of having teachers on board and to drive these things as well. And of course, then I wanted it to be kind of cross school, so to kind of share experiences and that sort of thing, because it can be quite different in different school settings. So Janine's going to talk a bit more about the kind of challenges and opportunities that came out of the network meetings that we had. So they were the main part of the project, but we also had some surveys that we did before and after, just to kind of get some ideas of what teachers thought about, you know, what actually does it mean to decolonize the curriculum and those sorts of things. Some basic sort of starting points, but actually what we did grew out of the network meetings. So that wasn't decided from the start. That kind of was part of that collaborative process that we wanted to develop. So like I say, then I'm not going to encroach on Janine's bits and pieces about kind of what came out of those network meetings and challenges and stuff, but I'm going to talk very briefly about that kind of the running of a cross-school online network and the collaboration and co-production process as part of that. I'm going to sort of try and structure that a little bit in terms of the challenges, but also opportunities. So I think I'll start with some of the opportunities that this afforded, and then think just a little bit about the kind of challenges as well. And I think in terms of the sort of key opportunities, I think actually kind of the context, the kind of what I've sort of, I guess it was post-pandemic or at least post-lockdown context. I kind of thought about that as part of writing a short piece for the Research Intelligence, the BERA issue in spring summer 2022. So the focus of that was pandemic, protest, recovery and opportunities. And actually that made me think about this as a specifically out of that kind of context of being post-pandemic, but also still we were very much working on an online environment. And when we asked teachers, did they want to do this face-to-face or online, then it was pretty clear, pretty unanimous that an online kind of format would be the best sort of solution. And actually, I think having that cross-school network would have been pretty much impossible without doing that online. I think, considering how very early on we realized how hard it was to facilitate, a time that most people could do and that sort of thing. And we ended up with about 30 participants, but some people were able to join most of the network meetings. Some were only able to dip into some of them, and some actually weren't able to sort of join any of those things. So actually, I think the online format did help, but it still didn't mean that everyone could join all the time. And I think actually what helped with that was having a shared area where we sort of shared resources, any kind of anonymized notes from the meetings, just to kind of get people, they were able to catch up and that sort of thing as well. So I think actually the online format was very helpful in lots of different ways. And I think if this had been before COVID, I think we would have really, I wouldn't have been able probably to facilitate it. But now, everyone was online, we used Zoom and so on. And actually, I think that's an aspect that moving forward, I want to look at developing more. Maybe some people in the room might have some ideas of how to do that, but actually having more of a developed sort of shared area where perhaps you can actually ask questions and that kind of thing as well. One last thing that I thought was an opportunity about doing this online as well was for me as the researcher to kind of be able to, because I didn't want it to be like, oh, the university set up this project, join it. Because Janine had kind of offered to run in all those things, I didn't want to kind of be too dominant in that. So that was easy actually online, I think. There is some research sort of suggesting that it's easier to lurk online than it is in person, I guess. Not that I was lurking in any kind of, untoward sort of way, but it was easier as a researcher not to kind of be so prominent, I think, in that. So that was really helpful with doing it online as well, and using that sort of online space. I think those were the main aspects that I kind of thought, when I was thinking about this as a post-pandemic sort of context that came out of that. And I think in terms of challenges, and I found this quite interesting when I started to look at the findings, especially from the survey beforehand, and thinking about sort of doing this in an online space was tricky. And I think looking at that first, the speech bubble at the top there, from Embra et al. There, thinking about, well, what do you want to get out of, using a more of a co-production type of a collaborative approach. And they talk about mutual engagement, joint enterprise and shared repertoire. And I think the shared repertoire, so capturing, communal resources and things, was a real strength actually of the project, because I was able to facilitate it. I was able to listen to things in terms of resources that teachers wanted, that kind of thing, and was able to sort of put together and summarize some of the key research, for example, on how to teach the transatlantic slave trade or approaches to empire, those sorts of things. So that was really, I think, a real strength of the network. It was more the mutual engagement, and perhaps that more than anything, that joint enterprise that I felt was quite tricky to do. Perhaps partially because online you don't have the same kind of personal connection. You perhaps don't get to know each other in the same way and that sort of thing. So that was part of that, I think. But also because we were discussing, obviously decolonizing of the history curriculum, it's not a straightforward concept. If you look at the second sort of bullet, speech bubble on the side, on the right hand side there, I think it was challenging because actually co-producing knowledge when the concept is contested can be quite tricky, and that's something that I really reflected quite a lot on as facilitating when I was facilitating the research project, that actually in the network, because there were lots of different ideas in terms of what it actually meant to decolonize the curriculum. Even though on the surface, perhaps, well, not even on the surface, they were all working toward this common goal. And I was really pleased in terms of, the appetite from teachers, history teachers, to join the network and to get involved in these discussions, to sharing expertise and all those sorts of things. But because there was a lot of different views on what it actually meant to decolonize the curriculum, that did sort of make it quite tricky to what it might actually look like in practice and so on, which I found quite interesting. But also, like I say, as the kind of researcher supporting this as well, it was something that I really reflected on and thought about when we develop this further, or if someone kind of asked, well, what might your suggestions be? And if you read the report, that's part of the report as well, then I would say, well, probably to think about, how can you have that shared space somehow, an online space for kind of sharing, not just sharing resources, but perhaps you can develop it further with questions and consultations and that sort of thing as well. And secondly, this thing with how can you make that online space feel a safe space, which we talked a lot about, and Janine's a great role model for that as well, which I thought was really important as part of the network and developing it. But also thinking a bit more about, how can you facilitate that? Do you meet in person first, or, that sort of thing? So yeah, and I think I'm getting towards the end of my 10 minutes. So that's my kind of take on that post-pandemic online aspects of the network. And like I say, I think it was the only way that we could have facilitated it, but at the same time, there were some challenges with that as well. Thanks. So I'll hand over to you, Janine, and just give me, just tell me when you want the slide to change, and I'll try and do that for you as we go along. All right.
Thank you. Yes, so like Anna was saying, we did come across challenges, but it is, I think, the biggest challenge is that it is a disputed concept, in the sense that decolonising the curriculum, there are many, many people, including academics, that dispute, A, there's a need for that, and B, that it is colonised. But I suppose if you look deep into it, we understand that the curriculum has a largely white narrative. The history curriculum does. Our secondary curriculum in general does, and the primary one really. However, the history particularly has come under a lot of scrutiny due to the lack of diversity. If we were just speaking earlier, just before this, about the national curriculum and the fact that it's not as diverse as it should be in nature, and therefore that's something that we really tried to focus on, diversifying the curriculum, but also addressing the issues. So why is it important to have this network? Well, because there's a lot of work to do in decolonising that curriculum, and also creating a curriculum that is anti-racist. So one of the things that came across from specialist teachers is that when minorities are often taught in the curriculum, it usually begins with the dehumanisation of the Black race. And what do we mean by that? So we mean it usually begins with slavery, or it begins with the first time an ethnic minority is discussed is the empire. I know many schools that discuss empire, and it's all positive in the sense that this is, look how incredible the British Empire was, completely disregarding what they did to those colonies and the people in there. So, and that's still the case now. So we've got a long way to go if we want to provide a curriculum that is racially diverse, and it be universally racially diverse across the country as well. One of the things that really struck me is in primary schools today, when we're learning about the nativity of Jesus, he's often still represented as a white man, and so we're taught from a very, very young age that the most famous biblical figure that we know is white, and that is a big, big problem. We know as a historical figure that Jesus was a Palestinian man. I myself a Palestinian, so he should look similar to me than he does a white person. we are both Palestinian. And even having an image of Jesus up as a white man contributes to that notion that we are we are not diverse in nature. We're not supporting this anti-racist rhetoric, and we're part of the problem as educators. So teaching a more representative history is not rewriting history. I am not being representative, is representing Jesus as a Palestinian brown man. But what I'm not rewriting history. So I'm not putting him across as to be a different race. I'm just telling the truth. And that's really, really, really important that is understood, because that is one of the biggest criticisms that we face as educators, particularly history educators. Not everyone was black. This is not black history, it's British history. Black history is British history. So that's why it's really important that we teach that. And it's about reteaching those stories that are omitted or neglected. And it's really important that's one of the things that we try to focus on within the network. Anna, if you move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So what are the barriers that we faced? So the barriers that we faced when attempting to decolonise, it was pretty much the same for everyone in the project. So whether they were trainees, history teachers, or heads of department, nearly everyone faced the same problems, and we got this from them. So the first one, it's not a whole school priority. It wasn't on SLT's agenda. It's not something that is usually coming from the top down, but we know in an educational setting, for the most successful strategies are the ones that come from the top down because of the level of accountability there. So it's putting anti-racist curricula on the map, really. There's also that notion of denial by history teachers themselves, particularly head of department. There was a feeling that teachers had to win over their head of departments in like, this is really important, we really need to do this. And I think in some cases, in largely white areas, it wasn't seen as important, but equally in diverse areas as well, the curriculum still wasn't anti-racist in nature or even diverse in nature. So it's that idea of teachers are really proud of their schemes of work, thinking it's really important, but it's the idea of sort of managing your staff, even when you are just a teacher. It's that idea of working alongside your head of department to try and get them to see the importance of it. Also, curriculum constraints was an issue. What I mean by that is, look at the GCSE curriculum, look at the A-level curriculum, you are struggling to find diversity in there in terms of the options that you can choose as well. And this is a massive government issue, but it's really difficult to diversify up there. You basically, what happened in this network is where the diversity came in, it was at Key Stage 3 for the most part, just because our hands were tied by the new GCSE curriculum. Also, poor subject knowledge, which then leads to a lot of mistakes. So teachers' racial literacy wasn't high. So we have to understand, but why is that? And then you got a lot of teachers who were scared to put a diverse topic on the curriculum, or put in a few diverse lessons in there, like the Black tutors for Key Stage 3, because they were worried of saying the wrong thing, teaching students inaccurate information. And also there was a lack of resources, and that's universal, because ethnic minorities have been omitted from British history throughout the test of time. We've got a lack of resources on there. That's not something that has been part of the national curriculum, something that we've been compelled to teach about. And therefore, we understood that there's a greater need for CPD in this area. And like Anna was saying at the beginning, a greater need for sharing resources. If you change the slide now, Anna, please. Thank you. So what were the consequences then? What opportunities did this network give us as history educators? Well, we got to share resources. So there's a shared area, and also you got to share concerns as well. So what I mean by that is like that I'm struggling with that, my SLT with this as well, my head of department's not very this. How can we sort of work around the structure that we're in and make it work and still put diversity on the map and still create changes that our students desperately need if we're going to create a successful anti-racist curriculum. And then teachers were able to speak to each other and provide solutions as well. So it's a network of discussion, really. Also, there was a greater confidence amongst history teachers to challenge staff in their department, but also SLT, to create an inclusive and anti-racist curriculum. You know, there was an increased number of staff, of colleagues saying, oh, please can we have an inset on this? Oh, please can we have some time in our department meetings to create this resource and adapt this scheme of work? And that's what I mean by challenging, and also having open and honest and difficult conversations. Also, there was CPD on how to decolonize existing schemes of work so that you're not starting from scratch, so teachers didn't feel overburdened. And there was also strong methods on how to talk, and strategies on how to teach really racially charged units such as slavery and the British Empire, and sort of what activities are appropriate and what they're not. Teachers commented on how that was incredibly beneficial. And just going with what Anna said at the very beginning, which was the sharing of resources. When we shared resources, it was incredible. And we shared organisations as well, and groups that have a lot of these resources already there. So teachers just go on to their websites, download, and then adapt for their school setting. And that's really what it's about. So one of the things one of the most important things that we got out of this, opportunity-wise, was the fact that if you have a Tudor scheme of work, if you have a medieval life scheme of work, it is not about throwing that to the side and starting from scratch on a diverse unit. It's about how can I make that unit diverse, and how can we make it anti-racist in nature. And that's what I feel that one of our greatest achievements of the network was. So it's over to Liz now.
Thanks, Janine. Yeah, Liz, I'll change over to your first slide.
Thank you. So for those of you that might not be familiar, People's History Museum, we're the National Museum of Democracy. We're based in Manchester, but we have national reach. And we're all about how people over the last 200 years in Britain have had to campaign and protest for things like getting the right to vote, for equality, for social justice. And in 2018, 2019, we started preparing for a year-long programme on the very wide sort of general topic of migration, that very broad theme. And this would include sort of exhibitions, events, learning offer, etc. And this eventually took place. It was all sort of postponed with the pandemic. So it was 2021, 22 that it happened. And that involved us working with a community programme team who's had personal experience of migration to really sort of shape and push forward their ideas for that programme. And a big part of that was to really sort of challenge our existing interpretation in the main galleries. And we also took part in some consultation with some various community groups as well. All of this led to internally a Decolonising the Collections project. So a lot of the stuff that you're talking about with education, it's running parallel in a lot of places, and we're seeing this across the sort of the heritage sector as well, them acknowledging that they're not doing enough, or they've been doing things wrong. And, you know, the conversation's changed a lot over the last few years, and needing to make sure that we're responding to that. And so when we were approached to join the teaching network, it was kind of a perfect time for us, fitting into this work that was happening at the museum. And I guess for me, there were sort of two good things, or potential things to come out of this network. One of them was to show how the collections at the museum could be used as a resource and could be sort of brought out a little bit more for teachers. And also just an opportunity for us as well to sort of understand what those barriers and constraints are for schools and see where we might better support going forward as well. And so just sort of reflecting on something that's kind of come up already as well. I think in my personal experience, I've been at the museum 9 years, and a lot of the time we build relationships with teachers, but it is with the teacher, not with the school, and then that relationship dies if a teacher moves on. And being a part of the network was a really good opportunity to see where it might be a better way of connecting in with schools or feeding into that work that's happening as well. Next slide, please, Anna. So these are just a few examples of some of the collections that we looked at. So I think it was April, in the spring, we had an open day at the museum. And the idea was to discuss with teachers how they can use the collections to change that narrative. And I made a point, particularly at the start, speaking about our own development as well and the work that we're doing to address the lack and misrepresentation of particular histories within our interpretation. And, you know, I think that's like a really important thing to show that we know that we're not doing things perfectly right now, and to talk about the steps that we're taking and that we're learning as we're going along. And hopefully, you know, the main galleries opened in 2010, so 13 years ago. And since then, things have changed considerably, and things might seem outdated in the way that we're sort of talking about certain things already. So the focus of the day was almost split into two, I guess. The first bit was we had a tour around the galleries, and we had a look at some of the collections, and then we had a look at some existing resources that we have at the museum. And with the tour, I think I wanted to split it so that the first bit was looking at the parts of the gallery that look at slavery, but I used that to talk about how it wasn't a very good representation of that history, and some of the work through consultation, or some of the work that we're going to be doing in the future, is going to be addressing that. So some of the things that we'd found, for example, is that first of all, we need to sort of show how slavery isn't something that happened in the past, but actually is still impacting society today and can still be felt by lots of people, by lots of institutions. And that enslaved people shouldn't be presented as victims all the time, but given their own narrative and their own they have their own history of revolt, fighting for their rights. Whereas even in our galleries, we tend to focus on people like Wilberforce as these sort of saviors, and that's not the right way to be teaching these histories. And that we also need to be highlighting personal experiences to add that human element as well, particularly for students who see it as something that happened a very long time ago. How do we make it relevant and create that sort of empathy and understanding and reflection through that? And then for the second half of the tour, it was about actually just focusing on people, sort of Black radicals, I guess, for want of a better word. Radicals as in people who have done really extraordinary things in history. So, for example, you can see up in the top left-hand corner here, we have William Cuffey, who was a Black Chartist leader. So even just talking about the Chartists, talking about democracy, just changing the narrative by the people who you're focusing on. So we have content in the collections and also in the archive linking to William Cuffey there. We've also got a banner next to it, which was something that was created and brought into the collections in 2019, 2020. And it's looking at the sort of key worker jobs that are fulfilled by migrant people and celebrating their contribution to work, but also acknowledging issues around workers' rights there as well. And then we've also got this logbook here, which was from a local group who were quite pivotal in setting up the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester in 1945. And so they were some of the collections that we looked at on the galleries there. And then we worked in sort of smaller groups and in pairs to think of ideas of how we can use the objects within the lessons as well. So use the collections as resources. And then we moved on to looking at a collection of archival resources, which is the sort of the bottom images here. So that we created these based around the Notting Hill riots a few years back, and we've not had opportunity to get any feedback on them. So it was quite a nice opportunity to hear from us how they worked or how people thought they could be improved before we sort of take them public. Next slide, please. And I think, reflecting on the project when we were sort of writing up this report and thinking about what we got out of it, on the left-hand side here is one of the quotes from the evaluation that we got from one of the teachers. We were getting feedback such as, even the people who'd been to the museum before, they'd never picked up on stuff discussed in the tour, and the conversations that we were having collectively as we were going around, it made them see things in a different light, and it sort of sparked that creative energy. So it wasn't necessarily about me telling teachers how to use the collections. They were having those conversations, and it was sparking that sort of curiosity as we were going round. And so for us, it's thinking about how we can draw out those stories, and sort of create tools and resources that teachers can lift and use as they want to as well. So not creating extra work, how can we support that? Because obviously time is precious. And the conversations and the research that come out of the network, that's going to feed into a lot of the work that we're doing at the museum as well. So it has been mutually beneficial, even in the short amount of time, that this first phase actually ran. So, for example, as I mentioned just briefly at the start, we have a Decolonising the Collections project, which is a long-term project that has recently started. And we're hoping that the end result will be a redesign of the permanent galleries. That's a really big job, but we're also looking at short and medium-term goals as well. What can we be doing with that being sort of the end goal? And I think for the future as well, how I would like to see the network developing. I guess I feel like at the moment we've only just scratched the surface, and I found it really useful talking to teachers, hearing some of the consultation findings from that Janina pulled together that she's just been through. But trying to sort of, I feel like there's a good basis there. So it's thinking about how can we move the relationship on and look at how we can collaborate a little bit more, creating some resources or doing some work that'll help schools and teachers and open up the collections more from our side. We're working on a project at the moment, reviewing our learning programmes. So all of our sessions and workshops are currently paused for 22 and 23. And this work is also helping to feed into that as well. So it'd be nice to see if the network continues, seeing how the teachers can feed into that work. And then once the new sessions have been redeveloped, that's like a legacy offer then that's will be available. And I guess, the conversations that we're having, sometimes it can be hard to justify or make that case for change. But I think young people are having these conversations anyway, and they're not being sheltered from the news and what they're seeing around them, or maybe what's happening personally to them. And they're the ones that we just need to make sure are properly sort of educated and understand the subject, because they're going to be the ones in the future making these changes, hopefully, or carrying on this campaign. And we want them to be going into all different jobs and all different careers and taking that learning and understanding and making things better in their own little way as well. So it is incredibly important, and hopefully this is just the start so far. Thank you. That's it from me.
Thanks, Liz.
Thank you for that presentation. I'd now like to invite Diane Warner, our respondent.
Thanks very much. It's lovely to be able to respond to this because I've been doing a bit of work, research with Anna on decolonising, not particularly in history, but in terms of generally in teacher education. But for history, I think in many ways as a subject, it has it's the ideal subject really to show us the way forward for decolonising. Maybe history specialists might not feel they've got very far, but it's, as I say, it's ideal to show the rest of the subject areas what we can be thinking about and what's important. So as a subject, it resiliently exposes the unseen. It does shake comfortable white narratives, and it can pretty uncompromisingly present difficult realities. In Anna, Janine and Lizzie's report, I think they take up this challenge and they present an honest, practical and thoughtful account that we can learn many things from and that can take us forward. It chimes with a lot of research that's gone on. Some recent work has come out from Marlon Moncrief's work. In his different his book, his research reports, articles, etc., I found that he offers convincing points against cultural reproduction and complicity in white and Eurocentric bias. And he states that what's happening is that within history, for example, the white Eurocentric bias reifies and perpetuates what has been seen as the norm. He and many other researchers challenge us to overturn this idea of objectivity. What's presented is just is, and it's normal. So overturn objectivity and normalcy, because otherwise they remain unseen, when in fact they are the foundational factors in white hegemonized history. Another researcher and a former SIG convener, Per Ailing, she also contends that history, which now, as decolonisers, we know and we see as hegemonic and violently wrought, must be challenged, can't remain unchallenged. And we can't blindly accept something that where violence has been normalised and valorised even. Okay, it's bringing it to the fore. And that picture from the People's History Museum of Caribbean immigrants, for example, in the 60s, trying to find accommodation and having signs on doors saying no coloured or no coloured men, to use the old term of coloured, alongside dogs, etc., at the time was just taken as disappointing and something to be ignored. But now it's seen as, how could this have happened? And in terms like the wars, where Black and other troops who fought, they were unseen. Okay, and they were all part of it. They were unseen and not accepted as being part of the victory forces, but only now slowly coming out that they were a whole part of the situation. So we're now in an age, and decolonising in history and in other areas is now showing up how stiflingly narrow our curricula is, and that some aspects of it have been valorised. And we see it as unbalanced, destabilising, undemocratic, where Black and Asian peoples, alongside other minoritised peoples, are now striving to be more represented. And the point made about younger people is that they are saying, well, where are we? Where are we in this discourse, in these visual representations? and they're demanding that they're seen and they're heard. So in this report, teachers are seen and schools are seen as the link. Per Ayling's work, she states and believes that schools and teachers are powerful agents to change what is seen as acceptable knowledge. And in this case, in history, it's white British stories. And these white British stories have until now been the pivot of our historical knowledge in the UK. And that so-called acceptable knowledge is being overturned. Also, decolonising, as made in a point made in the report, is not seen as part of the initial teacher education agenda. It's not in the core content framework. And indeed, the DFE article called Political Impartiality in Schools, published in February this year, is trying to hide away again anything they see as political and destabilizing. And one of the points they make in that report is this. It states, for more recent historical events, including those which are particularly contentious and disputed, political issues may be presented to pupils. This includes topics about empire and imperialism, on which there are differing partisan political views, which should be taught in a balanced manner. The whole tenor of that guidance, its guidance, is predicated on the ideas of balance, tolerance, appropriateness, and legal duty. So again, the voice behind it is sort of saying, be very careful what you say, okay? And they're trying to also tie in with the legal duty thing and the idea of a balance. So the government's voice is all about pushing things which are difficult to one side again. In Janine, Anna and Liz's report, it states that developments in school are often highly dependent on specific school and departmental context. And the point was made that it's quite hard to promote decolonising work. You have to argue your case with heads of department and the senior leadership team. So it often depends on individual teachers' passion and sense of agency there. So the report also states that teacher agency is seen as an ecological concept, always being enacted in a concrete situation, constrained and supported by cultural, structural, material resources available to them. So teacher agency, and often it is individual teachers who are passionate and want to move forward in this area, have to push against these barriers that was also mentioned in order to move through. And it's an ongoing thing, and that's why it was lovely to hear that maybe this report is really just scratching the surface. The work is ongoing, and it has to move forward. Otherwise, it will just come to a standstill. So the report is clear in that the authors and the other schools involved, that there is a will and a growing knowledge for this initiative to come together and to move forward. And through the report, I think it came across that the participants' understandings of diversity and what it can mean in practice on the ground and moving out in the community in terms of working with the museum is quite strong. And they also recognise that it also depends on intersections as well. So the schools involved recognise Eurocentrism, whiteness and maleness are other obstacles and barriers that they needed to understand as part of this whole decolonising endeavour. And the authors also show a desire to make history accessible, representative, as I said before, and relevant, and even more so in white schools, or mainly white schools, whereby if the teachers aren't doing it, then how are the children ever going to know and here. Okay, and part of that is the way they do it. So moving pupils' notions of Blackness in history is an interesting and tricky area, maybe, as part of decolonising. Yes, to move away from victim-focused accounts, the whole slavery, migration, economic dependency across the world, and to help children reclaim true histories, okay, in terms of how we've moved forward. So slavery, it's a contemporary thing, and how have we moved forward into that, and what has been learnt from what happened in the past. Okay, so it's this exposing of the hidden and the unaccounted, in order to raise the idea of what are the foundations of modern Britain. Okay, but the report recognises certain obstacles which have been retold to us this afternoon. The specifications of GCSE, the national curriculum, finding relevant resources, getting people on board and energising people in this work. But as I said, all too often the emphasis is placed on individual teachers who are challenged, pushed for time, and also pushed for knowledge creation as well. And as has been stated, so often teachers will feel they don't have the knowledge, or they're scared about moving into an area that they've got to do a lot of work on to find out more about. So that's sort of the subject, but also moving on in terms of this report, it's yes about the subject, but also about collaboration, which is really exciting, whereby the collaborators, the different schools and the museum, etc., well, the different schools particularly, moving outwards physically from the school environment into a museum space, in this case, and developing their knowledge with a museum officer and museum staff. And that increases layers of understanding about decolonising, how to infuse thinking and practice. And the teachers asking what's available and how can they be used effectively. And the education officer talking about the usefulness, the relevance, the attainability of the resources, and both working together about how they could be used in the curricula, on the ground, in the classroom. And there was a particularly exciting idea of resources that could enable teaching and learning about longer term consequences in history and decolonising it. I don't know particularly what the longer term consequences are, but it does sound really interesting. So the different roles played in this collaboration are particularly important, putting practitioners to the fore and being passionate as well. Okay, I notice I'm running out of time a little bit, so I'm just going to move on. So just to finish off, the initiative shows that teacher education needs guardians, guides, instigators and all the rest to push forward the decolonising agenda, which history, in this case, needs to be continually disrupted and opened up so that the status quo is changed, is moved, is challenged. And there's power in collaboration in the way it's set up and sustained. And it also collaboration embodies practices that are aligned with the endeavours of decolonising, such as empowerment, visibility, voice and inclusion. Thanks very much. I'll stop there because I think I've gone over time. Is that right, Christine?
Yes, you have. That's fine. Thank you, Diane.
You. Okay.
We've got a question, part statement, part question in the chat. So we'll start off with that. And if anyone then wants to pop in by either turning their microphone on or putting something in the chat, that'd be fine as well. So Giovanni Mailer has proposed this point to you. The research suggests that there has been limited progress in creating diverse curricula, especially given the resources, ITE training, CPD and research funding afforded by the new Labour government to address some of the issues highlighted. Did you mean a new Conservative government? I would hope.
No, no,
Are
no.
the
No.
team are the team
Sorry,
hosts?
Christine.
Go on.
No, I don't mean the Conservative government. I'm talking about the Labour government did, you know, there were created resources, there was the Jagba report, there were changes introduced into across the curriculum subjects, because I was involved in it. Vinny was also involved in multiverse and so on. So there was quite a lot that was done. So my question really is, it feels like we've gone back in time. So that's, you know, are the team hopeful real change will actually occur?
If I start off, if Janine and Liz want to come in afterwards, I think it's a really interesting question, I think, and it's the feeling that from the network and the discussions we've had there, I definitely think that there is an appetite for this, and it links into some of the research we've done with IT trainers or educators as well, where I feel there's something in that subject specificity, and you know, like you say, from above, we've kind of all acknowledged that, you know, it can be very hard to kind of make these changes and so on. But actually, to a certain extent, you can use Ofsted's desire for this subject specificity at the moment to kind of like push this kind of these ideas and this kind of agenda to decolonize, I think. And to a certain extent, I think you can see with the history teachers as well as IT educators that that kind of subject and the discipline and wanting to be an expert. And if you're going to be an expert in your discipline at the moment, part of that process is decolonizing the history curriculum, and that there's been sort of moves towards that. And I go out, and this isn't actually in, you know, my research report, but when I go out into schools as well, there are a lot of new inquiries, and we encourage our student teachers from an IT provider perspective to develop, you know, their kind of planning from inquiry questions. And that came up in the museum as well. I remember, Liz, we had that discussion in terms of how can you use these resources to design new inquiries. And I think that's the thing quite often, you know, Diane was talking about those kind of narratives that get told. And actually, yes, maybe you're diversifying the curriculum, but in history teaching, and if you approach it that way through inquiry questions, which is fairly kind of widely accepted, then you have to change the inquiry question and the key concepts that you're going to sort of investigate, and that kind of thing. And actually, by doing that and doing that in a new way, and being on top of your kind of disciplinary subject specific knowledge, decolonizing the curriculum, I think, has become kind of part of that, I think. But you're always fighting kind of for that, for all the reasons we've already mentioned, I think. So whether we'll be in the same place in 5 years, I mean, I don't know, but there's definitely been changes. When I go in to see lessons and the inquiries that schools are looking at, they are different from what they were when I was in school, which is a move, at least, I think. But yeah, we will keep, but it is reliant on individuals, which is problematic sometimes, isn't it? Because people move on and the changes and stuff like that. I don't know if that answered the question, if I've just, you know, stumbled on for too long, but I'll stop there.
No, but I mean, thank you. It's quite depressing really that we're still having the same conversation now.
I think also just that things, they're continually changing as well, and it's not something you can just learn and then you can teach it that way for the rest of your career. You're constantly having to build on that knowledge, and things change. Diane, what you were saying about how we need to continually disrupt, it's that, you know, it's evolving. Maybe that's where some of the lack of confidence comes from as well, because it's not something you can just study and then move on. But as Anna was saying, when the teachers were in the museum, that like inquiry-based learning, and that just naturally came out, and that's, you know, using questions and like all those different things. It was very sort of organic, and it happened quite naturally, which is why I think the collections are such a good resource for helping with that.
So you've got a question from Ruth. Ruth, could you unmute yourself, please?
Hi, yeah, sorry, I was just struggling to find the chat box to be able to feed in with the chat box. and to share some resources.
Oh, okay. Have you found it?
No, is it enabled?
Yes. Look for the little speech bubble on the top of your page. Okay, so there's some things going on in the chat here. Janet Orchard, having first done anti-racist training in 1985, I share other people's sense of deja vu here, but we need to carry on trying. New generation are caring about this and responding to BLM, in my judgment. Shouldn't we be thinking about the how that needs changing as well as the what, and with in-service as well as pre-service teachers? Vinny has just marked an MA dissertation by Head of History, where the subject is beginning to be decolonised, not diversified. The students clearly understand and appreciate this change, but his research has shown that the teachers are ineffectively prepared and unaware of how teaching about sensitive histories, e.g. slavery, affect the Black and global majority students in their classroom. We need space like Multiverse to showcase such courageous changes in schools. Can the panel tell us about other examples of good anti-racist practice?
Janine, do you want to answer that one?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer that. I think with teachers being ineffectively prepared, that's because it's not part of our training. It's not something you come into your PGCE and you learn, although it is now actually the past maybe 1 to 2 years. However, it's not every PGCE course is this part of your it's part of your training. For example, in every PGCE course for history, it is absolutely compulsory to be delivered training on how to teach the Holocaust. But it's not for diversifying the curriculum and creating an anti-racist curriculum. So it starts with ITT training. That's the best way. We've got to somehow make it compulsory that is taught. Otherwise, you're in a situation where you are teaching this because there's a desire, you want to teach it. The desire either comes from the pupils or it comes from teachers. That's what I've noticed from being a history educator. It's either the pupils going up to the teachers like, why are we not learning about this? What about this? Please, can we learn about my country and the partition in India? Please, can we learn about Black contributions to British society? This is actually what children are asking their teachers. And therefore, then teachers who want to create that change, want to have a curriculum that appeals to the demographic of their cohort, then go out and do this. But the problem is they're not equipped. In some cases, they're not equipped to do it because of the lack of reading that takes place. And also there are a lack of resources as well. So I think the best thing that I can advise there is networking. Read and network. There are many I think someone mentioned Nick Dennis earlier. He's a deputy head teacher in Hertfordshire, and he is he's got a blog, but also written a lot and spoken a lot as well. He holds conferences on specific subjects that such as there was something he did recently on the African kingdoms, and it's specific things that you can diversify and create an anti or basically develop anti-racism within your curriculum. And I think that's really important research. And but like I think it was Anna that said teachers are overworked in the sense that there's a lot to do here, so it's about devoting that time. I think other examples of anti-racist practice in terms of does this question relate to in terms of the actual curriculum itself, what topics you can diversify to be anti-racist, or on as a whole when diversifying a curriculum, what are the things that you need to do? If it's the latter, then that if we take that model that you've just described there in Yorkshire, without a shadow of the doubt, the issue comes from the senior leadership team. So it's about developing, it's about working alongside them, asking for meetings with the senior leadership team to put on whole school CPD. We can get these people in. There's a really good organisation called Justice to History, and they're literally putting forward justice to the neglected history. Bring them in, pay for them, ask your SLT to make that part of the history departments and other departments CPD on inset days. Again, it's got to come from us, unfortunately, but if we put the pressure on for our senior leadership teams to make it a priority, then only then can things like you just described there with sensitive histories be addressed accurately. We need to bring in-house training, whether it's reading or whether it's organisations or whether it's people to come in and address those and create a safe space where we can say, is this acceptable? I've done this before in my lesson, is that all right? I've done this and someone's told me that it's not acceptable to get my children under a table and recreate the Middle Passage in slavery. Someone's told me that's not acceptable. Can you tell me why that's not acceptable and what I can do as an alternative? Creating those safe spaces, really.
Thank you for that. Can I just quickly come back and say that this student of mine was on our MA on race education and decoloniality. So I think that we need not just initial teacher education to weave these elements in, but we need to encourage similar sorts of courses at MA level and encourage teachers to come onto those. And he was part of a cohort where we actually reduced the fees to half for teachers who actually put in interesting applications and proposals for research. So those sorts of initiatives and partnerships are needed between universities. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vinny. A couple of things in the chat. David Rawlings has drawn our attention to the Cargo Future Learn courses, and also APA has also added some guidance and resources as part of a Decolonising History project. And I'm just scrolling down to see if there are any more questions here. Do you see decolonisation as political? If so, what are its politics? And if so, does that necessarily commit practitioners to what Geoffrey Elton would have condemned as theoretical history? Is that a problem? A provoking question.
Yes, it is. I don't know that I can answer that in full, but I mean, go. Sorry, Diane, you can start.
Well, I was just going to say, well, obviously we don't see it as a problem, but with that government paper, Political Impartiality in Schools, it is being perceived as a problem, and they are tying it in with the prevent stuff by producing that paper. But it's not a problem, but there is a worry out there. And that's going to constrain senior leadership teams, people in senior leadership in universities, etc. That's what I think. So then it's going to be harder. Well, it is harder. And we have to keep relearning it every few years with new people coming on board, I think. That's the only point, Anna, if you wanted to add to that.
No, I think that's pretty much what from our point of view as teacher educators, definitely that it is being framed as that kind of problematic because it is political. And I know they've said about the Black Lives Matter movement as well, that's something that in that guidance as well, that shouldn't be kind of considered. Well, you should always be neutral, which of course, how am I supposed to, as a history teacher, teach, well, whatever, colonization, British Empire, as a neutral kind of voice in that, and am I that privileged white person that's got that neutral voice to kind of, to have that discussion then and kind of make judgments on that? It's really problematic. So I do think it's definitely framed in that way, which makes it a problem for us when we're discussing it with our student teachers. And I've shared that document with them that you referred to earlier, Diane, as well, with my PGC history students, and we've kind of analysed it and evaluated and kind of thinking about how can you be just subversive enough in your practice not to get in trouble, you know, while also acknowledging that actually I have got, you know, strong beliefs, you know, well, it's part of my teaching persona, you know, that kind of thing. So yeah.
I just want to say as well that everything is political. So every topic we choose to study, the curriculum, if you go into any secondary school, any primary school and look at their curriculums, that's a political decision taken by somebody. Somebody's done that. So history in itself is politics of the past. That's what it is. And yes, decolonising the curriculum is political, but not in the sense that, obviously I don't see it as something that is, we need it political impartiality. However, everything we study, everything we teach our students is political, whether it's present politics, whether it's past politics that feeds into present politics. So in itself, I don't see a way around this. I don't see a way around, as a history educator especially, you can not teach about these political constructs, really. That's my opinion.
Does anyone else have a question, a comment, any thoughts? No, if no one else has anything they'd like to share or say, then I think I'd like to thank our panel members today. Thank you to Janine, Liz and Anna, and thank you Diane for your response, and thank you everyone in the audience for being part of a really informative session today, and you know, a real example of research and practice working alongside each other for the betterment of children in schools. So thank you for coming today.